You're standing at the mouth of a shallow cave in the high desert of southern Oregon. Wind, dust, sagebrush running flat to the horizon. And in the dry dirt beneath your boots lies something that should not exist. A human being left it here 14,300 years ago that is older than the first Americans were ever supposed to be. That is the claim that cracked the textbooks in half. For almost 100 years, science swore that the first people reached the Americas around 13,000 years ago, and not one single day before that. But a handful of dried human waste, pulled from a cave called Paisley, proved every last one of them wrong. I stumbled onto this case buried inside a 2008 issue of the journal Science, and I have not been able to put it down since. Stay with me all the way to the end, because the one detail that finally forced the world to believe came out of a laboratory in Copenhagen, and it is stranger and lonelier than anything the doubters were afraid of. I still remember the exact moment it grabbed me. It was almost 2 in the morning. I had a cold cup of coffee going gray beside my keyboard, and I read one sentence out loud to an empty room. Someone had found human DNA in fossilized feces older than the entire story we tell about ourselves. I actually laughed because it sounded fake. Then I checked the source, and the source was real. Let me take you back to where this really begins, because the setting matters more than you would think. In the far south of Oregon, in Lake County, there is a place called the Paisley 5 Mile Point Caves. They are not deep, dramatic caverns. They are shallow openings worn into a ridge of volcanic rock, carved out long ago by the waves of a lake that has since dried into a pale basin called Summer Lake. If you drove past them, you would not look twice. That is exactly why what they held stayed hidden for so long. The caves were first dug in the late 1930s by a man named Luther Cressman, an archaeologist from the University of Oregon. Cressman was a careful worker, and he found tools, animal bones, and hints that people had sheltered there in the distant past. But the science of his time had no way to measure just how distant. Radiocarbon dating had not been invented yet. So Cressman recorded what he saw, boxed up his notes, and the caves went quiet for the better part of 70 years. Now here is where my obsession really took hold. Because the man who reopened those caves was not chasing glory. His name is Dennis Jenkins, and he was a field archaeologist with the University of Oregon who ran the school's archaeological field program out in that desert. Starting around 2002, Jenkins brought his students back to the Paisley Caves, and they began to dig again, slowly, one thin layer at a time. What they started pulling out of the dirt would end up putting Jenkins at the center of one of the ugliest fights in modern archaeology, because among the bones and the tools, his team found something else. Small, dried, unremarkable little lumps that most people would step over without a second thought. Coprolites. That is the polite scientific word for fossilized human excrement. And those little lumps were about to detonate under the foundation of everything we believed about how the Americas were peopled. Jenkins sent samples away for radiocarbon dating, the method that measures how much of a certain form of carbon has decayed inside old organic material. And the numbers that came back stopped him cold. The oldest of those coprolites dated to roughly 14,300 years before the present. To put that in plain terms, a human being sat inside that Oregon cave and relieved themselves more than 1,000 years before the people we were told were the very first Americans supposedly arrived. I want you to sit with how quiet and how enormous that is at the same time. No golden treasure, no carved monument, just the most human, ordinary trace a person can leave behind, waiting in the dark for 14,000 years to rewrite our entire origin story. When I first understood what those samples meant, I felt the hair go up on my arms, because it meant the official story I had been taught in school was not just incomplete, it was wrong. But to understand why a lump of ancient waste could shake the whole field, you have to understand the wall it slammed into, and that wall had a name. For most of the 20th century, the ruling idea in American archaeology was called Clovis First. It is named after a town in New Mexico near a place called Blackwater Draw, where in the 1930s diggers found beautifully made, fluted stone spear points lying alongside the bones of mammoths. Those distinctive points turned up again and again across North America, and when scientists finally dated them, they landed at roughly 13,000 years ago. The theory that grew out of that was clean and simple, and people loved it for exactly that reason. The story went like this. During the last ice age, so much of the world's water was locked up in glaciers that the sea level dropped, and a land bridge opened up between Siberia and Alaska across what is now the Bering Strait. A band of big game hunters walked across that bridge, then slipped south through a narrow, ice-free corridor that opened between two great sheets of glacier and spread out to become the first Americans, the Clovis people. First in, first everywhere. Case closed. And here is the part I have to be honest with you about, because I promised you honesty. For a long time, I understood why scientists clung to that story. It was tidy, it matched the spear points, it matched the timing of that ice-free corridor. Whenever somebody claimed to have found a site older than Clovis, the claim almost always fell apart under a hard look. The dates would turn out to be contaminated. The so-called tools would turn out to be rocks shaped by nature, not by hands. The Clovis First camp had been burned so many times by bad older sites that they had become fortress hard. They demanded absolute proof. And honestly, for a science, that is not a bad instinct. So when Jenkins announced coprolites older than Clovis out of an Oregon cave, the reaction was not celebration, it was suspicion. Sharp, public, and personal, because think about what a coprolite actually is. It is soft, it is organic, and critically, it does not stay locked in place the way a stone tool does. Water moves through cave dirt. It carries dissolved material up and down through the layers over thousands of years. So the immediate objection, the one that any careful person would raise, was devastating in its simplicity. What if that human material was younger than the layer it was found in and had simply washed down from above? What if the dirt around it was 14,000 years old, but the human trace inside it was far more recent, seeping down like coffee through a filter? That question nearly sank the whole thing. And I will be straight with you. When I first read the objection, I thought the doubters were probably right. But before I show you how that doubt shattered, I have to tell you about the piece that made this stop being a dry academic argument for me and start feeling like something the field genuinely did not want to look at. Because it was not just the age that unsettled people. It was what the DNA inside those coprolites said. Jenkins had done something clever. He did not just date the samples, he sent them to be genetically tested to see whose waste it actually was. And the man he sent them to was one of the most respected ancient DNA scientists alive, a Danish researcher named Eske Willerslev, who ran a world-class ancient genetics laboratory at the University of Copenhagen. Willerslev's lab was famous for exactly this kind of work, for pulling fragile genetic threads out of impossibly old material without ruining them. And the DNA that came back from those Paisley coprolites was human. Not just human, it carried genetic signatures, specific maternal lineages known as haplogroups A and B, that are found in Native Americans and in the ancient populations of Northeast Asia. In other words, the people who left those traces in that Oregon cave were the ancestors, or the close cousins of the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This was not some unknown vanished race. This was the deep, deep beginning of a story that runs directly into the present. When I read that, something shifted in me, because now the stakes were not just academic. This little cave in the Oregon desert was holding the physical proof that people were living in the Americas 1,000 years before the textbook allowed, and those people were tied by blood to the very continent they were on. And the response from a big part of the establishment was not to throw open the doors, it was to look for reasons the evidence could not count. Now I need to talk to the part of you that is still skeptical, because I know some of you are sitting there thinking there has to be an ordinary explanation, and you are right to think that. And I want you to stay for the next few minutes specifically, because this is the exact stretch of the story where my own doubt got taken apart piece by piece, and I would rather walk you through the honest version than sell you something easy. Here was the strongest case against Paisley, laid out fairly. First, the contamination worry I already mentioned. Ancient DNA is the most delicate thing you can imagine, and it is notoriously easy to pollute a sample with modern genetic material. Every archaeologist who handles a find, every student, every lab technician sheds skin cells and leaves traces. Critics pointed out that the caves had been dug decades earlier and revisited by many people, and they asked the obvious, brutal question. How do you know the human DNA is 14,000 years old and not from somebody on the 2002 dig team who handled the dirt? A prominent French genetics laboratory even published a challenge along these lines, arguing the human signal might be modern intrusion. Second, there was the water leaching problem. If groundwater could carry younger urine or other human material down into an older layer, then the 14,000-year-old date on the surrounding sediment might have nothing to do with the age of the human trace inside it. The two could be totally disconnected. And third, there was a suspicious absence. Clovis sites come with those unmistakable fluted spear points, but at the oldest levels of Paisley, Jenkins was not finding Clovis points. So the harder skeptics asked, if people were really there that early, where are their distinctive tools? Maybe, they suggested, this was not a real pre-Clovis site at all. Maybe it was a mess of mixed up layers that only looked ancient. I will admit, that stack of objections got to me. For a while, I set the whole case aside and told myself the doubters had probably won. It sounded like another older than Clovis claim that would quietly collapse the way so many had before it. That is what I finally understood sitting there with my cold coffee at 2 a.m, and it is exactly why I put everything I had into writing it down. Cases like Paisley and a dozen others that never made the headlines are what fill the 3 books I have put together under the titles First Threshold, Deep Signal, and Hidden Systems. Each one goes exactly where the official account refuses to go, following the evidence past the point where the framework breaks. If that is the kind of investigation you want to take further, all 3 are available for $97 at the link in the description, lowstoragens.org, and they go a great deal deeper than any single video can. But now let us get back to the moment that turned my doubt inside out, because this is where the story stops being comfortable for everyone involved. But Dennis Jenkins did not walk away. And this is the part that turned me back around. Instead of getting defensive, he did the thing real scientists are supposed to do and so rarely actually do. He treated every single objection as a test he had to pass, and he went back into that desert to pass them one at a time. To answer the contamination fear, his team changed how they dug. They began excavating with sterile procedures, using clean tools, taking control samples, doing the kind of forensic level care you would expect in a crime lab, not a dusty field trench. They tested the dig crew's own DNA so they could rule their own genetic fingerprints out. And critically, other independent laboratories were brought in to try to replicate the findings so it did not rest on one team's word. To answer the leaching worry, they did something I found genuinely brilliant. They dated the coprolites themselves directly, not just the dirt around them. And they went further. They tested the sediments for water-soluble chemistry. If younger material had really flooded down through the layers and contaminated everything, then the site would show the chemical signature of that kind of water movement, and the dates from different materials in the same layer would scatter and disagree. Instead, the dates held together. Multiple radiocarbon measurements on the ancient material lined up around that same deep age. The picture was consistent, not chaotic. And that missing tool problem, the one about no Clovis points, that did not stay a weakness. It flipped into the single most important clue in the entire case. Because Jenkins and his team kept digging, and in those old layers they did eventually find human-made stone tools. But they were not Clovis points. They were something else entirely. A different tradition of projectile points made in a different style, known as Western-stemmed points. And that is the detail I want to hand you, because it is the destination of this whole long journey, and it is the thing that finally silenced the room. In 2012, 4 years after that first paper that hooked me, Jenkins and a large team, including Eske Willerslev, published a follow-up study, again in the journal Science. The title alone tells you how far they had come. It described Clovis age Western-stemmed projectile points and human coprolites at the Paisley Caves, and what that paper laid out was quietly explosive. The Western stem points at Paisley dated to around the same age as Clovis, and the deepest human traces went back to that 14,300-year mark. But Western stemmed points are made in a fundamentally different way from Clovis points. They are shaped by a different technique, a different tradition, a different set of hands trained in a different way of doing things, and you cannot invent an entire separate tool-making tradition overnight. That kind of distinct technology takes generations, centuries to develop and spread. Do you feel the floor moving? Because here is what it means. If the people making Western stem points in the West were just as old as the Clovis people in the East, and their technology was completely different, then Clovis could not be the single mother culture that everyone descended from. There was more than one ancient population in the Americas at that early date, in different places, doing things their own way. The neat little story of one band walking across a land bridge and spreading out to become everyone, that story was finished. It could not carry the weight of what was in the ground at Paisley, and the way the world learned that truth was through fossilized human waste and a laboratory in Copenhagen carefully reading genetic ghosts out of it. That is the part that still gives me chills. The proof did not come from a temple or a tomb or a treasure. It came from the humblest thing a human body produces, preserved by pure luck in the dry desert air, waiting 14,000 years for someone patient enough to ask it the right question. Let me tell you why the Copenhagen piece is the real heart of this, because this is the exclusive detail that made me trust the whole thing. Willerslev's laboratory was under a microscope. Everyone knew that if the ancient DNA claim had any crack in it, careers would be damaged. So the team did something almost paranoid in its thoroughness. They took the danger of contamination that the critics had raised, and instead of dodging it, they aimed straight at it. Independent labs on different continents tested separate samples. The scientists' own genetic profiles were sequenced and used to exclude any modern intrusion. And when a rival group published its contamination challenge, Jenkins and his colleagues answered it directly in the literature, showing the ancient human signal survived every check. That is the moment my doubt truly broke. Not because someone told me to believe, but because I watched a group of scientists get handed the exact objections I myself believed in, and then methodically dismantle each one with fresh evidence from the field, out in the open, in the most demanding journals in the world. They did not ask for faith. They earned the conclusion the hard way. And here is the quieter thing, the part that turns this from a science story into something that keeps me up at night. For decades, older than Clovis claims were treated almost as a career death sentence. If you were a young archaeologist and you announced a pre-Clovis site, you risked being labeled a crank. The field had wrapped itself so tightly around the Clovis First idea that the evidence sitting in the ground in caves like Paisley could be found, boxed up by Luther Cressman back in the 1930s, and then simply left because the framework everyone used had no room for it. The dirt was talking the whole time. We were not built to listen. Think about that. Cressman dug those caves before the Second World War. The traces of these ancient people were within reach for 70 years, but the tools to read them did not exist yet, and just as importantly, the willingness to believe them did not exist yet. It took a stubborn field archaeologist willing to be doubted, a Danish genetics lab willing to be tested to destruction, and a pile of ancient human waste that refused to stay quiet to finally pry the door open. And once Paisley cracked it, other cracks that people had been ignoring suddenly looked a lot more serious. Sites across the Americas that had been dismissed as too old to be real started getting a second, more honest look. A place in Texas called the Buttermilk Creek Complex produced tools beneath a Clovis layer, pushing dates back further still. Down in South America, a site in Chile called Monteverde, which had been fought over bitterly for years, started to look less like an outlier and more like part of a pattern. Paisley did not just add 1,000 years to the calendar. It gave a whole generation of researchers permission to trust the evidence in front of them instead of the story in their heads. But I keep coming back to that shallow cave in the Oregon desert and to the strange smallness of the thing that changed everything. Because if you go looking for the moment the origin story of an entire hemisphere quietly turned over, you will not find it under a spotlight in a grand museum hall. You will find it in a dry rock shelter above a dead lake, in a lump of 14,300-year-old human waste described in the journal Science, read out of at a laboratory bench in Copenhagen by people who refused to look away. 14,300 years ago, a human being crouched in that cave. They were cold, probably. They were far from wherever their people first came from. They were living in a world of ice and mammoth and vast empty distances, and they had no idea that the most ordinary act of their day would outlast their name, their language, their entire world, and one day stand up in a courtroom of science to testify that they had been here first. Or at least that they had been here long before we ever gave them permission to be. That is what I finally understood. Sitting there with my cold coffee at 2 in the morning, the official story is not handed down from some perfect authority. It is a scaffolding that people build and cling to and defend, sometimes long past the point where the ground beneath it has already shifted. The truth waits patiently in the dirt. It does not care what we believe. It only waits for someone stubborn enough and humble enough to dig it up and actually listen. If you have ever felt that itch, the sense that the neat explanation you were handed is hiding something messier and more human underneath, then you already understand why I could not let this one go. You are the kind of person who would rather have the uncomfortable truth than the comfortable story. That is exactly the kind of person who ends up standing at the mouth of a cave in the Oregon desert, wondering what else we walked past for 70 years. So let me ask you something specific, and I really do want your answer. Those Western-stemmed points made by a completely separate tradition from Clovis at the same ancient age, does that tell you there were two separate groups of first Americans arriving different ways, maybe even down the coast by boat instead of across the land bridge? Or do you think it means people had been here so much longer than 14,000 years that both traditions had time to grow from one root we still have not? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I read them, and the best leads I ever get come from you. If this is the kind of case that keeps you up too, then stay with me, because this is what we do here. We go back to the sites everyone else closed the file on, and we open them again. The next trail I am following leads to a set of stone tools found under a layer that should not have anything human beneath it at all, in a place nobody was even supposed to be digging. That door is already cracked open. All that is left is to walk through it. Come with me. Before you go, here's what's next. This video is the overview, but stay with me inside the Unexplained Society, and I'll walk you through that coprolite DNA analysis step by step, picking up right where we stopped inside. You can ask me your own questions, and a real person, me, answers you myself. You're not alone. Thousands of mystery lovers are already in there. Just point your phone's camera at the code. Cancel anytime, one click, no risk. Now, if this changed how you see our past, wait until you see what they found buried in Turkey. A discovery so strange it defies explanation, and it's starting right here. Let's uncover the answer together.